The ranch had not had a good year in some time. The fences leaned. The south pasture had gone dry the summer before, and the summer before that. And the people of the town had begun to speak of the Crane place the way people speak of something they have already let go, quietly and without looking directly at it. Willa Crane was 34 years old, and she had 3 children, and she had a deed to land that was worth less every season. And on a Thursday in late October, she had exactly the kind of morning that makes a person stand very still in the middle of a yard and look at the sky for a long time without seeing it. He came up the road on foot. No horse, no wagon, no one ahead of him, and no one behind. He carried a single bag over one shoulder, and he walked the way a man walks when he is not in a hurry because he has learned that hurrying does not change much. He stopped at the gate. He took off his hat. And he said 4 words that were not a question and not quite a statement, and that Willa Crane would think about for a long time afterward. Not because they were remarkable words, but because of the way he said them, and because of what he did next. There are people who arrive in your life and announce themselves loudly. They make promises and they have plans, and they let you know in some manner or another that they have come to be known. And then there are the other kind, the kind who say very little and begin, who are already mending something before you have decided whether to trust them, who work as though the work itself is reason enough, and who do not seem to need you to witness it. Daniel Rowe was the second kind. He was by any account a quiet man. And quiet men in this life are either the safest thing you will ever know or the most dangerous. The town of Harlan, Colorado had not yet decided which. That winter was a long one. The pass closed in November, as it always did, and the world shrank down to what was near: the fire, the table, the sound of children breathing in the next room, the slow white accumulation outside every window. In weather like that, a person's true character is not hidden but revealed. The way cold reveals the shape of things that warmth kept soft and uncertain. Willa Crane had survived worse winters than this one. What she had not survived before, what she did not yet have a name for, was the particular strangeness of not surviving it alone. Some stories are about the things that happen. This one is mostly about the things that do not happen, the declarations that are never made, the questions that are never asked, the 10,000 small moments in which 2 people stand close to something and do not name it and go on with their work. And yet by spring the ranch would hold, the fences would stand, the children would be fed and warm and unafraid. And the people of the town of Harlan would find, without quite knowing when it had happened, that they had stopped calling the Crane place cursed. It was a Thursday in late October when Willa Crane stood in the yard and counted what she had left. She did not count it in her head. She counted it the way you count something when you already know the number and are simply confirming what you hoped was wrong. 3 children, 1 milk cow that had been giving less and less since August, a roof that held on the north side and did not on the south, and a deed to 160 acres of land that the soil itself seemed to have decided was no longer worth the effort. Her husband, Robert, had been dead 14 months. He had not died in any way that made a good story. There was no heroism in it, no particular injustice. He had taken sick in September of the year before, and he had grown smaller and quieter through October, and by the first week of November, he was gone. He had been a decent man and a middling farmer, and Willa had loved him in the practical, steady way that people love the things they have built their life around. When he died, she did not fall apart. She had 3 children and a ranch, and no time for falling apart. She had stood at his grave on a cold Tuesday morning with her eldest, Thomas, beside her, and she had said what needed saying, and she had gone home and made supper, and she had kept going. The town of Harlan had been kind at first, the way towns are kind when a thing is fresh. Neighbors brought food. The pastor stopped by twice. Mrs. Aldrich from the dry goods store had pressed Willa's hand one afternoon and told her she was brave, and Willa had thanked her and not said what she was thinking, which was that bravery had nothing to do with it. You kept going because there were children who needed feeding, and animals who needed tending, and a field that did not care whether you were grieving. Bravery was a word other people used for ordinary survival when they were watching it from a comfortable distance. By spring, the kindness had thinned, as kindness does when the novelty of a trouble wears away. By summer, there were other concerns in Harlan, and the Crane place had receded into the background of the town's attention. By October, 14 months after Robert's death, Willa understood that she was on her own in the truest sense. Not abandoned, not disliked. Simply no longer at the center of anyone's worry but her own. The south pasture had gone dry for the second straight summer. The irrigation ditch that ran along the east fence had silted up in July, and she had not had the hands to clear it. Thomas was 11 and strong for his age, but 11 was still 11. The younger two, Clara, who was 8, and the boy James, who had just turned 6, were children still and needed more than they could give. She had hired a hand in the spring, a young man named Percy who had come through Harlan looking for seasonal work. He had been adequate and not much more, and in August he had left for a mining camp to the north without a great deal of notice. She had not replaced him. She was not sure by October that she could afford to. The cattle she had sold to pay the property taxes had been the cattle she could least afford to sell, and the price she had gotten was the price a man gets when a buyer knows he does not need to offer more. Some things in this life are too large for naming. The feeling that accumulates when you have made every sensible decision and done every necessary thing and still find yourself standing in a yard in late October, looking at a fence that will not survive the winter. That is one of those things. Willa did not name it. She stood in the yard and looked at the fence, and then she looked at the sky, which was the pale and particular blue of a Colorado October, the kind of blue that is beautiful and indifferent in equal measure, and she thought about what she was going to do. She was still thinking about it when she heard the gate. He was on foot, which was the first thing she noticed. No horse, no wagon. A man alone on the road with a single canvas bag over one shoulder and a hat that had seen better years. He was not young, but he was not old. Somewhere in the middle stretch of a man's life. That decade or so, when a man is capable of everything and certain of nothing. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and his face was weathered in the way of a man who has spent most of his years outside and has no particular feelings about it either way. He stopped at the gate. He put his hand on the post, not pushing it open, just resting there. He looked at the ranch the way a man looks at something he is trying to place, not judging it, not approving of it, simply reading it the way you read a page. Then he took off his hat and he said, "I will work for nothing but a roof." Willa did not say anything for a moment. She looked at him. She was not a fearful woman by nature, but she was a careful one, and careful and fearful are not the same thing. She looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had used them for most of his life. She looked at his boots, which were worn but not ruined. She looked at his face, which told her nothing except that he was not hiding it. "There is not much of a roof," she said. "I can see that," he said. He said it without particular feeling, the way you state a thing that is simply true. She asked him his name. He said Daniel Rowe. She asked him where he was from. He said various places, and something in the plain honesty of that answer, the fact that he did not manufacture a more reassuring one, settled something in her that had been braced. She told him she had children. He nodded. She told him the work was hard, and the pay was nothing, and the roof he was working for leaked in 2 places. He said he had slept under worse. She stood there for another moment in the pale October light and looked at the fence that would not survive the winter, and looked at the man at the gate and thought about Thomas, who was trying to do the work of a grown man at 11 years old and getting thinner for it. She thought about the ditch that needed clearing before the first freeze. She thought about the south pasture and the cattle she could not afford to lose, and the winter that was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. "The bunkhouse is small," she said at last. "There is a stove, but it needs a new piece of pipe." "I can fit a pipe," he said. She opened the gate. He did not thank her. He simply stepped through, settled his bag on his shoulder, and looked at the ranch again with that same steady, reading look. And then he asked where she wanted him to start, and Willa Crane pointed at the fence, and Daniel Rowe put his hat back on and went to work. The fence was done by the end of the second day. Not patched, not propped. Done. New posts where the old ones had rotted through, the wire pulled taut and stapled clean, the corner braces set at angles that would hold through whatever the winter chose to bring. Willa walked the line on the morning of the third day and did not say anything about it. She ran her hand along one of the new posts, the way you test a thing you expected to find wanting, and do not. She went back to the house and made breakfast, and did not mention the fence at supper. And Daniel Rowe did not mention it either, and somehow the silence on the subject said more than either of them could have managed with words. He had a way of working that she had not seen before in a hired man or in any man she could readily recall. He did not work quickly, exactly, but he did not stop. There was no wasted motion in it. He did not stand back often to assess what he had done. He simply moved from one thing to the next with the steadiness of a man who has made his peace with the fact that there is always more to do and has decided that this is acceptable. The bunkhouse pipe was fitted by the end of the first evening. The loose board on the porch step, the one that had been loose since April and that Willa had been meaning to fix and had not had time, was nailed down on the morning of the fourth day before she had asked or mentioned it. She noticed it when she came out with the milk pail. She stood on it once, testing. It held. Thomas noticed too, though he did not say so directly. He was 11 and trying hard to be a man about things, which meant he watched without appearing to watch and said less than he was thinking. On the third morning, Willa saw him standing near the fence line while Daniel worked. Not helping. Just present, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the post-hole digger moving in and out of the ground. Daniel did not tell him to go away and did not make a show of including him. He simply worked. And Thomas watched. And after a while, Daniel handed the boy the tamping rod without a word, and Thomas took it, and they worked together for the better part of an hour in what appeared to be complete and mutual satisfaction. Willa watched from the kitchen window, and then went back to her bread. Clara was less cautious. Clara was 8 and had not yet learned to approach new things sideways. On the fourth morning, she appeared at the bunkhouse door while Daniel was eating his breakfast, and asked him directly whether he had a horse somewhere and why he did not, and whether he had ever had one, and what its name had been. Daniel answered each question in turn, briefly and without condescension, the way a man answers a child when he is not performing patience but simply has it. He had owned a horse, he said, a gray, named nothing in particular. Clara found this unsatisfactory, and told him so. He agreed that it was. Clara appeared at the bunkhouse door again the following morning, which Willa noted and said nothing about. The irrigation ditch was the larger work. It had silted through the summer, and the silt had set hard in the October cold, and clearing it properly required more than one pair of hands. On a Tuesday morning, Daniel appeared at the kitchen door and asked Willa if Thomas could be spared for the day. She said yes. They worked the ditch from mid-morning until the light failed, and when they came in for supper, Thomas was tired in the clean way that boys are tired when they have done real work and know it, and he ate more than usual and went to bed without being asked. Daniel ate his supper at the table with the family, as he had begun doing by the end of the first week. Not by any formal invitation, but by the kind of quiet gravitational shift that happens when an arrangement becomes a habit, and the habit becomes simply how things are. He did not talk much at table. He answered what was asked of him, and he listened to the children, and occasionally he said something brief and dry that was not quite a joke, but caused Thomas to look sideways at his plate in a way that was very close to smiling. The town, meanwhile, was forming its opinions. Harlan was not a large place, and a stranger working a widow's ranch was the kind of thing that did not pass unobserved. Mrs. Aldrich had noted the new posts on the crane fence from the road and mentioned them to her husband. And her husband had mentioned them to the men at the feed store. And by the end of the second week there was a general awareness in Harlan that Willa Crane had taken on a hired hand about whom nobody knew very much. This was not in itself considered an acceptable state of affairs. Mrs. Aldrich came to call on a Wednesday afternoon, bringing a jar of preserved plums that was more pretext than gift. She sat at Willa's kitchen table and drank her tea and asked after the children, and then asked, in the particular tone that is not quite casual, how Willa was managing. Willa said she was managing well enough. Mrs. Aldrich said she had noticed some work being done on the fence, and Willa said yes, she had taken on a hand for the season. Mrs. Aldrich asked his name and where he was from, and Willa gave his name and said he had come through looking for work. There was a pause of the kind that carries weight. Mrs. Aldrich said that it was difficult, of course, knowing who a person was when they had no people in the area. She said it not unkindly, but without any particular kindness either. Willa looked at her and said that the fence was standing, and the ditch was cleared, and the roof no longer leaked on the south side, and that she found these things sufficient recommendation. Mrs. Aldrich finished her tea and left the plums, and said she was sure Willa knew best, in a tone that suggested she was not entirely sure of this. Daniel did not know about Mrs. Aldrich's visit, or if he did, he gave no sign of it. He had begun on the barn roof by then, replacing the shingles that had warped and split over 2 summers of neglect. Willa could hear him up there in the mornings, the steady sound of the hammer, unhurried, regular as a clock. There was something in that sound, the simple, repeated evidence of a person doing what they said they would do, that she had not realized she had been missing until she heard it. She did not name what she felt about it. She simply went about her work and let the sound of the hammer do what it was doing, which was something she had no precise word for and did not need one. The pass closed on the 3rd of November, which was earlier than usual, and earlier than anyone in Harlan had planned for. There was one day of warning, a sky that turned the particular yellow-gray that meant serious weather. And then the snow came in earnest and did not stop for 4 days. The road north disappeared under 2 feet of it by the second morning. The road south was passable in name only. Harlan pulled inward, the way small places do in hard weather, each household becoming its own small world of fire and lamplight and the sound of wind working at the eaves. At the Crane Ranch, Daniel moved his few things from the bunkhouse to the small room off the barn, which was warmer, and which Willa had suggested without making a particular matter of it. He thanked her and moved his things, and that was the end of the discussion. The days settled into a shape that was not quite routine but had the feeling of one. Daniel was up before the light, tending the animals, breaking the ice on the water trough, bringing wood to the porch before Willa came out to start the fire. By the time she had the stove going, he had already done an hour of work in the dark, and he came in for coffee with the cold still on his coat and sat at the far end of the table and did not require anything from her, which she found, after a lifetime of people who required things, to be a form of consideration she had not known to value. She poured his coffee and he said thank you, and she said nothing, and they sat in the early quiet of the kitchen while the children slept and the snow accumulated against the windows. And it was, though neither of them would have used the word, peaceful. The children had claimed him by then in the way children claim people they have decided to trust, which is to say without asking permission and without ceremony. James, the youngest, had taken to following Daniel on the morning rounds, bundled into so many layers that he moved with some difficulty, and Daniel allowed this without comment, simply adjusting his pace to something a 6-year-old could match. Clara had appointed herself the keeper of Daniel's coffee cup, refilling it with great seriousness whenever it fell below half. Thomas had progressed from watching to helping to something closer to working alongside, and there was a conversation between them on a Tuesday evening over the repair of a harness that lasted nearly half an hour, which was longer than Thomas had voluntarily spoken to any adult in the 14 months since his father died. Willa heard it from the other room and did not go in. Some things, if you look at them directly, go away. She had learned this early, and it had served her. It was on a Thursday in late November that Garrett Yule came to the ranch. He arrived in a wagon despite the road, which told you something about the kind of man he was, the kind who considered his own inconvenience a form of argument. He was a land buyer, or called himself one, with interests in 3 counties and a manner that was cordial in the way of a man who has found cordiality useful. He had approached Willa twice before, once in the spring and once in July, with offers for the Crane land that were framed as favors. The spring offer had been low. The July offer had been lower, which was not how offers were supposed to work, and which told her everything she needed to know about what he thought of her position. He sat at her kitchen table and put his hat on his knee and talked about the winter and the state of the range and the difficulty of a woman managing alone. And he said this last thing not cruelly, but in the practiced tone of a man who has said it before and found it effective. He had a new figure, he said. He felt it was fair given the condition of the property. He set it on the table between them as though it were a generous thing, and it was not. It was an insult wearing the clothes of reasonableness, and Willa recognized it as such and kept her face still and said she would think about it. Daniel had come in from the barn during this exchange and was standing at the wash basin with his back to the room. He did not turn around. He washed his hands with the deliberateness of a man who is in no hurry and has nowhere particular to be, and he dried them. And then he turned and looked at Garrett Yule with an expression that was not threatening and not hostile, and contained nothing that could be objected to. And yet, Garrett Yule stopped talking in the middle of a sentence about market conditions and did not immediately find the thread of it again. Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee. He leaned against the counter. He did not say a word. He simply stood there in the way that a man stands when he lives in a place, unhurried and at ease, and the kitchen felt different with him standing in it than it had felt a moment before. Garrett Yule picked up his hat from his knee and said he would leave the figure with her to consider, and he left before his coffee had cooled. Willa did not look at Daniel after Garrett left. She cleared the cups from the table and stood at the window and watched the wagon move back down the road toward town. Daniel finished his coffee and set the cup in the basin and put on his coat and went back out to the barn without comment. There were things between them by then that had accumulated without being spoken. Small things, the size of a glance or a pause or a cup refilled without asking. Not over them. Beside them. That was where they both stood, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so, and that was its own kind of honesty. The lamp on the porch rail burned every night that winter. Willa had begun putting it there in the first week of November, more out of habit than intention, and she had not stopped. It was a small thing, a candle in a glass, and it lit nothing much. A circle of porch, the top of the steps, the first few feet of frozen yard. But it was there when Daniel came in from the evening rounds, and he had begun, without remarking on it, to blow it out when he passed. Which meant that each night when Willa heard the small sound of it going dark, she knew that everyone was in, and the cold was locked outside, and the children were asleep, and the day was finished. There was no word for what that meant to her. She did not look for one. She pulled her quilt up and listened to the wind and the silence beneath it, and she slept. Spring came to the Crane Ranch the way it always came to that part of Colorado. Not all at once, but in negotiations. A warm day, then a cold week, then 2 warm days together. And then one morning, the snow on the south-facing slope pulled back from the fence line like a curtain being drawn. And the ground beneath was dark and willing, and the air carried the particular smell of water, moving again in places that had been frozen since November. The pass opened on a Thursday in late March, which was later than usual, and which meant that the winter had been longer and harder than most, and which also meant that it was over. The cattle had come through. The barn roof had held. The irrigation ditch, cleared in October, moved water the first week of April with no persuasion required. The south pasture, for the first time in 2 years, was going to be worth something. Harlan adjusted its opinion of the Crane place in the quiet way that towns adjust opinions they cannot openly retract, by simply beginning to speak of it differently, and by not acknowledging that they had ever spoken of it otherwise. Men at the feed store noted that the Crane fence was the best-kept line in that section of the valley. A neighbor named Briggs, whose own irrigation ran parallel to Willa's, stopped by in early April to ask about the ditch work and ended up staying 2 hours talking with Daniel about soil and water and the particular drainage problems of that elevation. He left with the look of a man who has found a conversation useful, which was as high a compliment as Briggs was known to pay. Mrs. Aldrich did not call again with preserved plums, but she nodded at Willa in the street with a warmth that had not been present in the November nod, and in Harlan that passed for a retraction. It was as such things went, as close to an apology as the town was going to get, and Willa accepted it as such without remark. Garrett Yule did not return. His figure, left on the kitchen table in November, had never been answered, and after a certain number of weeks an unanswered offer becomes its own reply. Willa had neither written nor spoken a word about it, and Daniel had never raised the subject, and the matter had dissolved into the winter along with a number of other things that had been tried and found insufficient. The land was not for sale. It had not been for sale in November, and it was considerably less for sale now, with the ditch running clean and the south pasture greening and a barn roof that would not require attention for another 10 years. Some things, given time and the right pair of hands, stop being problems. The Crane Ranch was one of them. It was James who asked first. He asked on a Tuesday morning in early April, in the direct and uncalculating way of a 6-year-old, who has not yet learned that some questions require a longer approach. He was sitting on the porch step watching Daniel work the near pasture, and he called out across the yard and asked if Daniel was going to stay, now that the snow was gone. Daniel stopped what he was doing. He looked at the boy for a moment, the way a man looks at something that has asked him a question he has been asking himself. Then he said he reckoned that depended on whether he was still needed. James considered this with great seriousness, and then said that he was, and returned to whatever he had been doing with the stick and the patch of mud beside the step. Daniel stood in the pasture for another moment, then went back to his work. The conversation was over. It had also, in its way, decided something. Willa had heard it from the kitchen. She was making bread, her hands in the dough, and she heard her youngest son's voice and then Daniel's, and then the silence that followed, which was a different quality of silence than the one before. She did not go to the window. She worked the dough and let the morning proceed and did not examine too closely what she was feeling, which was something she had grown careful about over the course of a long winter in close quarters, with a quiet man who had not asked anything of her, and who had, in not asking, somehow made the asking unnecessary. She shaped the loaves and set them to rise and washed her hands and stood at the window then, and the pasture was bright in the April light, and Daniel was mending the gatepost that the freeze had shifted, unhurried, as he was always unhurried, as though the work were not a means to anything but simply what the morning was for. She asked him that evening. Not formally, not with preamble. She asked him over bread, which was fitting, in the kitchen where most of the things between them had not quite been said. She set the loaf on the board and cut it, and asked him, without looking up from the cutting, if he had thought about what came next. He said he had. She asked what he had thought. There was a pause of the kind that is not uncomfortable but that has weight, and then he said that he thought the south fence was going to need attention before the summer cattle came through, and that the well casing had a crack in it that would widen if it was not seen to, and that the cedar in the woodlot was ready to come down and would keep them in timber for 2 winters if it was cut right. Willa set down the bread knife. She looked at him then, for the first time in the conversation, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way that was the closest thing he had to a smile. And she understood that he had answered her question fully, and that no further words were required on the subject. The fire burned that night as it had burned every night of the winter, and the children slept. And the lamp on the porch rail held its small light against the dark, and the pasture beyond the fence was black and wet and full of the slow, patient work of spring returning to the ground. The horses stood quiet in the corral. The pines on the ridge held the last of the cold in their upper branches and let it go, degree by degree, as the night wore on. The creek that had run under ice since November moved openly now, saying the thing that water says when it is no longer held, which is nothing in particular and everything at once. The smoke from the chimney rose straight in the still air, and the world continued as it does, without ceremony and without apology. And the Crane place sat in the valley, with its lights on and its fences standing, and its ditch running clear to the south pasture, and it looked, to anyone who passed on the road that night, like a place that intended to remain. And that was the story of Willa Crane and Daniel Rowe, a woman who arrived at the edge of losing everything and held on long enough for the right kind of quiet to find her, and a man who asked for nothing but a roof and left in the end, with considerably more than that, though he would not have put it in those terms. Let me know in the comments how this one felt. I hope it found you well. See you in the next one.